Welcome to the Church Digital Podcast. Through this podcast, we'll talk about the technological innovations within the church. But more than tech for tech itself, we'll address deeper questions. Is disciple making possible digitally? How should we approach the digital mission field? Can a biblically grounded church operate in digital space? Oh, and where does the Metaverse fit into all this? Whether you're a big or small church, an established church, or a startup church plant, the Church Digital's goal is to help churches like yours learn to be a multiplying church, digitally and physically. Our heart, that churches like yours would discover a newfound focus on disciple making that will revolutionize your church. And now, here's your host, Jeff Reed.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Church Digital Podcast. Jeff Reed here, founder of Church Digital, Digital Church Network. And you got episode 275. We got Jay Kranda coming up right around the corner. Excited about this. Anytime we get Jay Kranda on, well, we'll get into that here in a little bit. It's gonna be good, some good stuff. Hey, we've got a learning community coming up with Leadership Network. We've been talking about it all of this season. We've been talking about a digital learning community, a Metaverse virtual learning community, getting exposed to the idea of digital communities and virtual reality communities and what churches look like in that space. Even talking about doing digital and Metaverse mission trips, getting your people exposed to some new concepts, some new ideas in digital and in virtual reality ministry. And so if you're interested in those learning communities, check out leadnet.org/DLC for the digital one, or leadnet.org/MLC, Metaverse Learning Community, for that one as well. We'll put links in the show notes. We've talked about those in past episodes, so check it out. And we're going to segue really right here into Jay Kranda as we're talking about, digital learning communities and Metaverse learning communities and seeing things differently. We're going to be hanging out with Jay, digital pastor, online campus pastor. What is your actual title, Jay? I feel like I ask you this every time.
Online community pastor.
Online community pastor for Saddleback Church. That changed. It was not online community before, was it?
It changed like a couple years ago, but it has changed many times. But yes,
I was about to say you've kind of adapted along the way. Probably one of the OGs of online ministry, Jay Kranda, and he's been on the podcast quite a few times. And if you've ever heard the podcast before with Jay, who lives in Southern California, Los Angeles specifically, a Lakers fan, and you've ever listened to even some of the older podcasts with Ray DiArmas and I, who are more Miami Heat fans, you've heard maybe some conversations going back and forth about the greatness of the Lakers, how LeBron left Miami to go to a greater land, and things are going to be awesome, and LeBron's the greatness there is, and I mean we got a title, so I don't. Are you setting up for the title? So yes. But I'm just curious because the Miami Heat they're taking it to the Celtics right now when we're doing this recording. The podcast will play later.
Yeah,
we'll probably be in the finals when this airs. And where are the Lakers again? I forget. What's going on?
Hey, Western Conference Finals. We were terrible at the trade season deadline. Hey, I'll take it all day. All right. We were great. It was great. But yeah, no, I'm a Heat. I mean, the Heat are amazing. They're really, Jimmy Buckets is the man. I was messaging with Ray about it. He messaged me. He said something about something I posted on Instagram. He said, "Hey Jay, you're killing it like in this thing in ministry." And I replied, just like the Nuggets killed the Lakers. And I sent that to him this week. So,
just like the Nuggets killed the Lakers. It's beautiful. And so is LeBron going to retire? I mean, let's get down to brass tacks. This is what the audience wants to know. Is LeBron done?
Yeah. I listened to a couple podcasts and that talk about sports, and I always think that when they talk about sports, I'm always like, I'm not listening to this for their sports take, and I get annoyed. So I'm imagining somebody right now listening to this and going, just talk about ministry, please. No, he's not retiring.
He's not retiring.
He's just, LeBron is the master strategist.
Yeah.
And so everybody bugs, like I always say this, like, everybody says how they don't want their politicians or their sports people or whoever to share their opinions. And then we all share our opinions about their opinions. Mm-hmm. And so, everybody. He's the person of this age. He wants to control it all. And so just like we all control it. So he love it or hate it, but I love it. I love LeBron. I love his planning. He's so good at it. And so we got a title out of it. So hey, if he can pressure the Lakers to try to make sure they act wisely over the summer, I'm all game for it. It's not my team at the end of the day. So it could be a mess at any point.
Do they make the finals next year?
Probably not, just based off of what they can do. But I'm a lifelong Laker fan, so I'm here for the long journey. So awesome. I'm game for it.
Good for you. All right, so that was the sports take on the Church Digital podcast here. Thank you for humoring us. This is literally the only time I ever talk sports on the podcast. Honestly, it's the only time I talk sports, period. So I've got Jay Kranda
I know this, Jeff.
Yeah,
I could say that about you. I was like, I don't know why. I could start asking about how the game is played, and I feel like you would start to be
not a clue.
You would triangle offense.
I have not even watched. No, I know what the triangle offense is.
OG Laker. Come on,
I do. I appreciate. I have no idea how it's played, but I know it came out of Riley, so I know the history of it. But I can honestly.
Dude, that's the thing.
Yeah.
Riley Laker, come on! You can't have me hate on the Heat. Yeah. They got Riley.
All I know is that I have not watched one in NBA game this year. That's how much sports I'm involved in right now. So thank you.
Well, I will say just transitioning to digital. One of the weird things about the NBA is the NBA is one of these most talked about sports. But their viewership is terrible. They've really struggled with people actually watching games because most people tweet about it. There's accounts like House of Highlights on Instagram and TikTok. And so most young people experience it in clips because it's a very clickable kind of small moment type of sport. But they deal with this thing. I did this blog post a couple years ago, and it's still true, where like if you look at the social engagement of NBA, it's like the top. It's over the NFL and all this. But if you look at viewership, they really struggle because they have more games. And so it's this really interesting digital thing where like it's kind of like a church. A church can be maybe constantly talked about, but people who actually show up to the room is very low. So it's this really interesting like dichotomy that they kind of wrestle with. And they're trying to drive more, because people like me will watch games, but the average person, I mean, I try to watch a full basketball game and it's hard because it's 2.5 hours. It's a lot of timeouts, and so it's kind of a lot of the church stuff. There is some parallels there.
Interesting. I actually remember that YouTube video back in the day. You were paralleled to. It's good, some good stuff. Quality editing out of Jay Kranda. Good stuff. Have you watched any of the NBA on the Metaverse virtual reality?
I have, yeah.
What's your take on that?
I mean, it's really cool that you could sit courtside and kind of watch these plays. I mean, the biggest struggle is just the quality of the stream, because it's not a 1080p or anything, because there's so much data in that point of view. Yep. They cap it at a 180 view, essentially, where you turn around and it's dark. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of this one. And so it's really weird because there's so much data in there that it's just pixelated. So it's cool. You can be at the side or you can be under the basket and you can see it. It's very immersive. But at the end of the day, all this stuff comes down to it feeling pixelated at moments. I mean, it's the difference why cartoon-ish types of experiences feel very crisp, and any real life ones feel pixelated, because the cartoons versions tend to be, one color, and they can kind of merge all together and it looks crisp. So I think a lot of these experiences depends on the quality. It comes, obviously our eyes are so high, are so advanced for obvious reasons that it's hard. So it's really cool, but I've watched like probably 20 minutes worth of a game in there, and I could definitely feel why it's something that like this will be a very compelling experience, but it needs to get to a quality that's compelling. Also, it's for sure a better experience if you watch playback versus live. Live is even more kind of janky. And so I watched one game live on my Quest 2 at one point, and it was just, yeah. So it's like using a Palm Pilot or even like a BlackBerry. You're like, I could see why this is going to be great. But it needs to be more, and so I think so I like it, but it's definitely not to what it needs to be.
Apple's new headset, you gonna buy it? Are you excited about what's coming out?
I am probably not going to buy it, but we'll see. I don't know.
You can't make that a Saddleback expense.
I think I might have a hard time, but we'll see what it is. I know they're speculating it's going to be $3K or something, so I don't know. We'll see what the reality is. I mean, I didn't buy the Quest Pro, so but yeah, it's funny. I actually just met with a guy who builds VR worlds yesterday. He goes to our church, and I was confessing to him I haven't put on my Quest 2 in quite a while. So he was trying to get me in because he builds a bunch of worlds in VR chat for his business. And so, but I was like, oh yeah, I need to, because I was asking him about like, how has Microsoft shutting down AltSpace VR impacted VR chat? And, of course he throws shade at AltSpace VR. So that's how those people play.
Yeah. I mean, not that I wanted to spend time on this, but AltSpace VR is like, was a non-event compared to VR chat. AltSpace VR had like,
but most people had built stuff in AltSpace VR,
which was crazy to me. Like I never understood why churches, why they found it was because it was safe. They trusted, Microsoft.
No, that's 100% why. Yeah. But I think the thought is, well, Microsoft acquired them. It's going to have this future. I think there's a lot of other things, but yeah, you're right. It was the safe. I mean, yeah, this guy, he's been in VR chat for a long time, and he's built many worlds. I hosted an event through the church in one of his VR chat worlds, and about a year ago. But he always cautions me, as he always does this funny thing as a pastor. He's like, okay, Pastor Jay, like it's gonna be like different. Like you'll see stuff. Like he's like, it's like I'm stepping into, like the red district at Amsterdam.
That's what I call it, like, man. It's the red light district, 100%.
So I was like, crack it up. Anyways, I know we're supposed to talk about something else.
Yeah, but I mean, it's funny. We're supposed to talk about experimenting within the church, and we're talking about, what you're doing in the red light district of VR chat. So we actually kind of set it up pretty well. So you're at a mega giga church. You've got a new boss, by the way. Let's talk about that. How's the new boss coming out? The new lead pastor. What's his name again?
The new boss.
Woods.
Andy
Wood.
Andy.
Yeah.
Andy Wood.
Yeah. How's that
Andy
going?
Wood. It's going amazing, man. It's awesome. Yeah, I'm very grateful to be able to be at the church in this season. So it's really fun to see. I mean, you don't really get the opportunity many times to be a part of a handoff. Like I feel like it's like this generational type of case study. And so it has been, I mean, I was very blessed to be at our church with our founding pastor, and then to, for the last, 13 years or whatever. And then to kind of go into this new season to have I'm just utterly amazed at both Pastor Rick and by Pastor Andy, how they've just navigated this. I mean, it's funny. People ask me different things, and I'm just like, I don't know how it could go smoother. Like in the sense of the actual, like, I don't know. I talk to other friends and I see things that have happened at other transitions, and I'm like, no, I mean, that's not. This is really fun. Yeah, it's still the weird thing is to have a pastor, your lead pastor, only 5 years older than you or whatever is a really strange. I'm not used to that because I was used to Pastor Rick, who is a lot 30 years older than me or whatever. And so it's been really fun. So it's been fun. We are in a really fun season. Digital is very important with where we're going, and so yeah, it's been great.
Very cool. Were there a lot of changes, or organizationally when Andy came in? Was it like immediate urgency? Was it, hey, we're gonna observe and learn and then do changes? Like what's his leadership style in the transition?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, definitely a little bit of both, of just getting the lay of the land. I think I can't, like, there's a lot there where, like, I'm not a part of those conversations, but yeah, there's been a lot of just assessing and realignment of where we're going, and it's been it's been a really nice. I mean, yeah, they're so dialed in with how to do this, but it really is a crazy. I mean, our church, we are a giga church or whatever you want to call us, but it's when I talk to other, I was talking to somebody at another church, actually a church in Florida, and yesterday morning, and they were talking about something about their org, and they were talking about struggling with getting things done, and I was working inter-department with different people, and their churches probably only have like 5 staff members, and I'm like, well, from my perspective, that seems super easy, and I was trying to encourage them because, with a church with, a couple hundred people on staff, a bunch of, it's getting stuff done here it's complex. And so I was trying to encourage them, like, it could be a lot harder. and so like, I can't even imagine, I don't even get how Pastor Andy navigates all the things. Like there's so many moving pieces, but it's been very good in our season. So yeah.
Very cool. All right, so let's dig in here a little bit, and all this has been prelude. We've talked about how Metaverse, and I know you guys were exploring the Metaverse and testing some things in VR, doing some groups. You talked about VR chat, which is interesting. You're looking at a new season coming in with a new leader, and so some changes with that. So often I've seen lately with churches that they really are, especially post-COVID now, they've lost that experimental edge. They're going back to what's comfortable, what's traditional. Like I'm not saying ostrich bearing the head and pretending it's February 2020, but it feels like it's, hey, we're wanting to play it safe. And the idea of experimenting and taking risks, I don't know if it's economical or if it's just exhaustion, but there doesn't seem to be that experimental edge like there was maybe within the past year or so. I don't know. Have you felt that, or have you talked to some churches that might be struggling with that? Like, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's hard when there are things. The classic is not everybody in the org probably needs to be always experimenting. Their role, kind of depending on their volunteer role, staff role, whatever, they might just have a task to be done. So I think it can be difficult at times to kind of understand, or how do you cast vision around, not doing the same thing all the time, but also like, you don't necessarily want your food person always experimenting, and so it's like, or even like maybe your maintenance person to always be messing around with stuff. And so I think churches have a hard time navigating how to communicate that to everybody. And then the other thing is that coming out of COVID, I think there was just a lot of priorities to build stuff back up. And it can be hard to, as you're kind of, I would think of it kind of like, it's like different seasons of life where, when you first have kids, you're just trying to figure out how to sleep and how to eat and the rhythm and how to, it's like what they always say when you first have a kid, they usually tell you, like, after you leave the hospital and everything, just figure out, like, go out all together, like, and just learn how to, like, get back to normal life. And so sometimes I think in different seasons, different things are a priority. And so coming out of COVID, I think it was just a priority of getting the weekend back together. And I think for a lot of churches, they kind of probably just leaned a little too heavy too long into just making the weekend work. Again, meaning that, one of the struggles in every part of the country and the world was impacted differently around COVID and how that is. But a lot of churches, the weekend just isn't the same type of driver, and it doesn't mean you can't become efficient at it, and there isn't things to get dialed back in. But I think it's also like, hey, maybe the reality is that the weekend isn't the number one front door anymore, meaning your building. It doesn't mean the building's not important, doesn't mean. And so I think there's just that, like, when urgency comes in, you kind of drift back to just trying to keep things alive, and it's because the season of your church is. But I think long term, it's just, hey, you gotta keep that spirit of, like, entrepreneurship. It's hey, when do you get space? Actually, I was in a meeting yesterday, and one of our pastors said, he said, because we're in, and it was a good point, because we're always kind of driving towards the weekend, at least in this season, he's like, we never get a moment to kind of back up and look at what's working and not. And so it's like, I was just reading this book about, it was about your life and rhythm, and it was just about rhythms in life. And one of the thoughts was, in your own weekly time, how much do you allocate any time in your week or your month to do deep thinking? And so, like, I do this a lot with my team, where I have a couple younger people on my team, and they started very idealistic and kind of like, I'm going to do everything. And then they got to the point where like, oh, wow, I can't do everything. I got to like prioritize stuff. And I said, yeah, one of the things you got to figure out is in your week, schedule deep thinking time to kind of evaluate everything you're doing. So like, I think churches, they're just so focused on the weekend and just making that work again and, pay the bills and get all the hard work that kind of COVID kind of disrupted. I think though, we forget that, maybe we're investing too much energy on something that's not delivering the same results, or maybe we need to allocate this or that. So it can be hard. I mean, even Google, for example, Google was the famous like 10% of your time to test. And then, at the same time, they wasted billions of dollars. I mean, that's why the founders had to like step down, because they were wasting too much time on random projects of like, all sorts of stuff. I mean, this was the famous autopilot program. I'm forgetting what it is. It's not. Anyways, they wasted like $1 billion because they were doing too much testing on the side, and so it's like there is this balance. But I totally get why churches drift away from it.
That's good. Man, there was a lot there, Jay. You just we're packing it in. It's interesting. Have you met Jay? Have you met Tyler Sansom? Have I connected you two?
Mm-hmm.
Before, and he's doing the learning community with us, and it's interesting. Like you said early on, it was, hey, the Sunday morning isn't the front door that it used to be, or whatever the vernacular that it was around that. And I'm actually curious, and the learning community. The reason I'm asking is the learning community we're doing is with Tyler. Tyler's actually co-leading it with me. He is. We're talking about how, moving beyond the weekend, and the weekend plays a part, but it's not the behemoth that it once was. What does that look like for Saddleback? Does Saddleback at the place? I know it's a giga. You guys have massive buildings. What does a non-weekend or a lesser emphasis weekend look like?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that. So I'm more saying it from the perspective of it's like, for example, for us as a church, and every church would have probably a little bit of a different feeling around this, but and your time and place in history and where you're at, your geography all determine some of these answers. But for us, it wouldn't be so much that we obviously stop the weekend or even don't prioritize it. I think for us, it probably just means understanding the on-ramps or entry points that a new person might come in. So maybe pre this type of strategy, we might go, well, everybody just comes to the weekend, and then from the weekend, they fill out a connection card and blah, 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 blah. I think for us, Pastor Rick said this years ago. He talked about the idea of side doors are going to be kind of the future of the American church. People aren't, and he was alluding to, the empty buildings in Europe, the empty church cathedrals that are beautiful, that are empty, and how, most people are coming to Jesus not coming through a worship service. They're coming through a small group or a relational outreach or some kind of connection. And I think we've benefited off of this populist type of Christianity in America the last 100 years, really. I mean, it's from our founding, but really over the last evangelical type of movement in the U.S. has been super strong since the 1900s. And so you kind of, if you think about it that way, it's just like small groups, outreach opportunities, and the lean is going to be, it's going to be too decentralized. It's going to get too loosey goosey because you're not going to really know what it means. It's like Salvation Army. It's like, what does it actually mean? Their outreach is super powerful, but their church is super weak. I'm generalizing, but if you talk to most people in Salvation Army, that's kind of what has happened. And then you just have food banks. Long term, they just become, a church starts doing a food bank outreach to reach and build relationships, and long term, all the faith kind of gets drained from it potentially. It's kind of what's happened with a lot of the universities on the East Coast. And so I think it's just side doors. And I still think, I would argue with most people about this. I have that. I don't think the future of the American church is the way of Europe necessarily. I just don't. I think it's possible, but I think there's a lot of tells in our culture that people are very upset about where we're going, and I think it doesn't mean that the future of the American culture is Christian. I just think that there's probably a future where the American church is not persecuted that way. I think it's going to be. I think there's still a chance. I think Christians really love the nuclear theology. Because we kind of read the end of the book of Revelations, we go, well, this is where we're going, and I would say, yeah, but that could happen in 1,000,000 years. So I think, yeah. So I think it's just like more outreach, more doing ministry on people's terms. Obviously, more digital type of things where people start digital. It just means the building is going to become a more core strategy than a outreach strategy. Potentially. Now, I don't know what that means fully for our church because we're still in the, our church is doing a lot of like our buildings are, we've experienced a lot of growth this last year. There's a lot of stuff there that is still happening for us. And that's why I kind of go, I don't think that season is fully done, but yeah, it's going to be curious. And digital obviously is a big part of that. I don't know if churches know what that means, but it's definitely going to be a big part of it.
Yeah, let's unpack core strategy. You said so. It's not going to be the evangelism strategy or the front door strategy, but it's core. What do you mean by that?
So I'm just alluding to that. Particularly on the idea that maybe if you look at your budget and your time, your talent, treasures, type of layout, that you might allocate percentage less around the weekend, for example, at some point in the future. And so again, this has already happened. If you talk to anybody in the Middle East, they do the weekend, but they're doing a lot more. A lot of churches are doing a lot more resourcing around outreach opportunities on digital. They're doing a lot more Bible study focus because, every country is different, but a lot of countries you can publicly worship, but you can't publicly convert. And so if you're born into a Muslim family, you can't convert. But if you're born into a Christian family, you're allowed to go to church, and a lot of those countries are trying to kind of genetically force the Christian community to die, essentially. So it's like, we're going to allow you to worship, and we're going to tell other countries you can worship so that we don't get in trouble. But what we're saying is, after your family dies, no one's really going to be. It's kind of like siloed off into how many kids you can have within your own community. And so I think those are signs. Like I don't go into a country like Saudi Arabia or something and go, oh, I'm going to just check out church on Sunday. But I know the church is still thriving there, and it's thriving around digital platforms. It's thriving around Bible study. So I think that's the sign, is like, now that's an extremist view of the future. It's like it's super extreme, but it's you look at that and you go, what if that happens in the next 30 years, and you kind of go, yeah, you're probably not going to be 50% of your budget or 30% of your budget allocated to the weekend. It might be towards a small group strategy or a discipleship strategy. I was talking to a guy actually not too far away from you about Small Circle, that's on. It's in. He has a ministry where he does discipleship through an app. It's a really powerful thing, and I could totally see more churches having a pastor that has this mentorship app that you encourage people anywhere to do these one-on-one relationships. So, yeah, what it looks like could be a variance, but I think it's just, if you look around the world and if you look around history, like, this is already played out, unfortunately. Doesn't mean it's our history, but I think if you forecast it, you can see a possible timeline where that happens.
Yeah, I want to come back to the global church. I want to ask some questions centered around that. But even like the idea of the discipleship and the mobile app and some of the things, how do you experiment towards some of those things, or what steps would you recommend experimenting with within the physical church? Just in my context, Digital Church Network, I see a lot of experimenting. I see a lot of leaning in and new ideas, but really it's new church plants. It's individuals that don't have baggage and sometimes a lack of vision, and there's less baggage to kind of work through. And so, you in your context, you've been able historically to have a lot more freedom to explore ideas and to experiment. And Saddleback. But how would a normal church even start to wrestle with the idea of experimenting and trying to do something different?
Yeah, I just told one of our campus pastors that my job title was definitely less defined than anybody. And so I think I've been able to have a lot of momentum, or I've been able to influence my part of the strategy at least a lot more, because I have a lot more autonomy, because it's less defined. So the more defined a role is, I think less opportunities to kind of experiment.
Right.
And so, like, a classic example would be like an HR department for a church, or like, whoever manages accounting, their experimenting might be just around what software technology you use and, convert it. So it's like, I have like a ton of opportunity because there's no real, at least when I started, there was nothing really written. And most of the stuff that's written is very conceptual. It's not like a playbook as some of these other things. So I think, first off, your role kind of determines how much experimenting you get to do. And so I think there's that. I would say, one of the things that I have really harped on myself, and I would encourage any pastor in any church, one of the mantras that I kind of repeat is that our job is not to get people in a room. Our job is to produce fruit or an outcome. And so the thought is that the room experience is still valuable. And, again, I would argue with anybody, even in the digital space, people get married, and even in the online space, they get married and they connect physically. And until that experience changes, we'll really talk about full digital church in that sense. I mean, there's a reason why you get married and then you move in together. And so I think we're pretty far ways away from that fully experience, like replacing that. And I would even argue, even if that is, it will be kind of a fringe thing, probably, potentially even in 100 years from now. But the thought is there are, the challenge would be for any church, any ministry really, would be, your job isn't to get people in a room. Your job is to produce something in their lives. So, for example, like if you want to, if your job is to be over the parent ministry at your church, your job isn't to put on a parent event or create parent resources. Your job is to encourage your members and attenders in the area of parenting. So the deliverable could be an event you put on, or the deliverable could be a digital resource. And so it could be, well, we do this event once a year, or we create a podcast where parents can listen on the go. And so I think it's just this encouragement is, what are you trying to do in your role, and how can digital aid that? And practically what it means, usually in experimenting, I would say, I think a digital is very important track of where we're going and where we are now, that I would say, just look at your next year, and whatever you're doing, integrate one digital offering in your rhythm. And so, like, for example, my church does, we do Discover Your Purpose. It was formerly called Class at our church. And all of our campuses do this monthly in person. I might go to a campus and go, hey, I think you doing that in person in your yearly rhythm is really important. What if you experiment twice a year doing that on Zoom? And so it's not replacing it, but it's just introducing one small integration of digital, because you probably have people at your campus that can't come to the room. They might actually engage in a Zoom better. There's probably people that are engaging you online that coming to the room is hard. Maybe the first step is this. And so I think it's, hey, think about your role isn't to get people in a room and tell them to do something. Your goal is to produce fruit in your lives. How can you innovate to do that better? And sometimes you just need the 30,000 square foot view to kind of back up and just be like, oh, it's kind of like what memorials do, like you're busy. You go to a funeral or a memorial and you're like, oh, wow, I need to like hug my kids. I need to go on vacation with my wife. It just resets you. It resets you what's important. And I think a lot of times churches just don't reset on what they're doing or what their job is. And so I think I would first go, what are you trying to produce? It's not, the room is an option. It's not the option. It might be still. And then introduce some small experimenting in your yearly flow just to see. Because the key here I've found is that iteration is how you get clarity. And so you don't go, again, the classic example of this is it's like when PayPal and eBay launched and they're like, I'm not going to put my credit card online. And everybody was like, the arrogant, prideful part of people went, I'm never going to put my credit card online. Well, the thought was they weren't going to put the credit card online in that version of the internet. And you flash forward 10 years and you're like, we all have our credit card online. And the thought is because we think it's not going to evolve, and it does. And so it's like the people who go, I'm never going to use a VR headset. And you're like, okay, we've been here before. Like, I'm not saying in this current set, you're going to be like, cartoonish, jumping around with no legs. You know what I mean? But in 10 years, if this is completely different and your work bought it for you and you're working with people in a virtual space, you probably will. And I'm not going to show my receipts, but it's going to like it. And so I think it's just like, let's iterate. And so it's confusing and foggy and you don't need to know it all. You just take one step. And so that would be my encouragement is like, how do you integrate digital? Like, just do one thing in this next 6 months. And trust me, you do that one thing, you'll learn. And then that's part of my is like, what's the fruit you're trying to do? And then just do one small thing. You don't got to like completely do it all. Just do one small thing. And trust me, I've benefited, and I know, Jeff, you have too. I've benefited through 15 years of doing a bunch of small digital things. And I have clarity. It doesn't mean I have complete clarity of where we're going, but I definitely have some clarity. So, and I can navigate the future a little bit better because of that.
Yeah. One of the things, and actually I'm not, I was about to say, actually, I would love your take on this. I would love your take anyway. Like that's a very rude thing to say. Actually, I'm really interested in how you would answer this question. I've seen in a lot of mega and giga churches your size, maybe a little smaller even, the expectation of perfection and such a high standard that really prevents an experiment from happening. A fear of failure, the unacceptance of failure, prevents the idea of actually exploring and trying something different. Because the idea is we can barely handle perfection with what we are doing, much less trying something different. What's the old Aaron Sorkin TV show, Studio 60 something on the Sunset Strip, where you would always have that like countdown. I don't know if you've ever watched that TV show, but they had a countdown clock. It would roll 167 hours and it would always count down to the next time that they did whatever the TV show they were doing. It's like a Saturday Night Live spoof, but there was so much fear that was built into the next Sunday. There was so much expectation and so much urgency that's onto that and the perfection of that they really never had the opportunity to experiment. And I've seen that in real time with churches because there's so much expectation, there's so much demand towards that because there's this perception of excellence, or this desire for excellence. Is that how do you combat that? Do you see that? Do you relate to that? Like, talk to me a little bit about excellence.
There's a spectrum. I think first I would go to, like, I think from top down leadership, from the lead pastor to the elders, whoever, are they providing that space, and that value of, our culture for a long time was try anything one time, but don't try it twice. And meaning, like, learn from it, fail forward, type of concept. So I think the leader casts that vision and that space to make that happen. So it's not about knowing, it's, the idea is like with Twitter, and like you can tweet and you can have stuff misspelled and there's a lot of forgiveness, but there's a difference when it goes to print. And so I think it's just knowing what you're trying to do. So I think leadership, creating that culture, is really important. I've benefited from being part of a lot of cultures where that was been kind of figured out. I also think that there's a lot of, I don't know how to say it. Like, I notice, especially when I'm talking to people, on other people wanting to do digital things in their church, and they tend to be younger. There's a lot of arrogance around that they should just listen to you. And it's the you haven't done anything to be listened to yet type of thought was where I would go. And I've struggled with this, definitely, but I've benefited long term to become more, it's the Columbo, ask more questions, don't lead with this is my idea, and then also pick your strategic times to lean in. And so I think I've learned that if I can, it's the idea with money, if I can be a good steward with a little, God will give me more. And I be a good steward with what I have. So for example, like, people will go, a question that I've been asked in the past is like, I've done some help, I've done some consulting outside of my own org, and people will ask me like, Jay, how do you do your job and you do this other stuff? And I don't do a lot of it, but I said, well, do your job well. If you do your job well, they won't question if you're doing something else. So if you are bad at your job and then you start doing something else, they're going to see it as a time thing. And so I think it's a tension there where you gotta know, can you do this in this season? And so I think, trust me, I've had many times where I've been corrected and I've been, I've said the wrong thing, and I've learned through that. And I've been grateful to have amazing bosses that have told me, like, I still remember one of the things early on in my role. One of my bosses, one of my mentors, said, Jay, sometimes when you talk, you say I too much. Like, I did this or something. And I was young and I was, I had to wrestle through, well, maybe it was me, or, like, I had to get, and I think, but I heard that from my leadership of like, and they weren't saying it like I was a terrible person. They were just giving me feedback, and I heard that and I listened. And so, and then also just understanding too, like, a lot of times you don't have all the data, like, as a young leader, like, that's a huge thing. Like I could think about all these things I want my church to do, but I don't know what our budget is. I don't know where we're at. Like, there's so much I don't know. And I think the more you as a leader more come to the place of like knowing that you don't know it all, and ask more questions in the process. So like, I might think that this is better than whatever my pastor's doing, but I have to go, I don't know it all. I literally don't know it all. And then second, instead of going, you're wrong, just ask the question. And then I've found long-term, as I'm consistent in my own faith with God, I'm consistent doing my own stuff, I've benefited long-term from like just being and then good steward with what you're given. Just long-term, you're given more. Might not be as much as, somebody wants or whatever, but I think it's just that it comes from so first, it's top-down vision of like creating that culture where people can experiment. And then I think a lot of like, you just gotta, you gotta know your lane. Now, I joke a lot with other people that, friends who have new jobs and do new things, and and I find out about it, I joke back. I go, I'm just boring. I'm still at my church. I'm definitely a guy who is very consistent in that area. So I know I might be the extreme, and doesn't mean people have to be that. I have amazing friends that are doing amazing things, and they've been at 10 different orgs in the last 10 years, and that's totally okay too. But I think if you're really thinking about, if I'm talking about a young dude or a woman who's pastoring at a church and you want to move it forward, I would just say, trust your leadership, ask a lot of questions, be a good steward with what you got. And I've found that, generally long term, trust me, I've had seasons where I haven't felt that, but I'm on the other end of it, where like I'm now in a season where I feel the pressure that I got to deliver, not the worry that I'm being ignored. But that would be my journey on it, especially as somebody who's been at the same church for, almost 15 years. So that would be my perspective.
Beautiful. And let's flip the script. And just even as we're wrapping up the show here, you're a leader, longstanding leader, an older leader at a church, and you got a whippersnapper who's talking crazy ideas and saying "I" too much, and trying to bring about what you're perceiving as aggressive change, digital or not, doesn't matter in this context. How do you respond? What's the wise way in 2023 to respond in situations like that?
To the young leader.
To the young leader.
Yeah, I think that there's a perspective that I've gravitated towards. I use the example of, like, I remember when I came to faith in high school that I really struggled that my brothers didn't know Jesus, and I remember I did everything. I was doing everything that I could to kind of convert, but I was their older brother, and and they kind of knew punk Jay. And they knew all my imperfections. And so one of my youth pastors at this time said something to me that was very profound. And I still remember to this day that, you know how you love your brothers so much? And I'm like, yeah, I do. He's like, do you know that God loves them more? And don't you think God's going to do everything in his power to make sure that if they can know him, they're going to know him? And I was like, that's true. I believe you. And he's like, you do what you need to do, like be faithful with what you have, be a good steward, but trust God. And so I would say on the other end, to a young leader, the perspective is God cares more about your church and more about your community than you. And so you have tons of dreams, and that fiery spirit is there for a reason, but trust God's timing in it. And I mean, you could go through the history books of all the different leaders that had to wait their time. I mean, you think about some of the conversations we're having now, even we've had the last couple of years about race, and you think about the things that somebody like Martin Luther King didn't get to experience. Like, wouldn't it have been fair for him to experience the blessing of all the things? I mean, the types of things we're talking now are still hard, but it's very different than what it was in the civil rights era. And so he didn't get to experience Barack Obama and all these things. Like, and so in one angle, you might go, man, that's really crappy for Martin Luther King, which I guess it was. But I think on the flip, he played his role in moving our country forward. And so I would say, get a more eternal perspective on your role in helping your church go forward. Like, don't get so wrapped up in, I think of it as like the Jeremiah example, where Jeremiah didn't get to experience the blessings of all the things he was talking about. And he's the one that had the famous verse, like, I have wonderful plans for you. And he most likely lived the rest of his life in captivity, not knowing anybody who actually really listened to him. And so I think it's easy. What we're saying in like digital change, what we're actually saying is we want to be there when it all happens. And I think that's okay to ask that and desire that, but just understand sometimes God's plan doesn't involve us ever knowing what actually happened. And so I think just come from an eternal perspective. I've found generally that, because of especially in the US, I think there's a lot more you can do. It might take more relational investment, but it's the classic example, and this would be my hard conversation with a leader, is if you're so focused on telling people how smart you are, you've already failed. Like, allow your reputation to prove who you are. So if you have to tell people you're smart, then maybe you are smart, but nobody really cares. Nobody really wants to listen to you. But if you just do the work and prove your concept, it's like our faith. Like, we got to live out what we read every day in the Bible, and it's our reputation, it's our testimony. So have a testimony in your digital, like, just solve it. Like, I'm typically not a good, I tend to not be a good person to complain to things about, because I'm like, then solve it, and then I would say all the time, well, like, it's hard. Yeah, it's hard. If it was easy, an AI bot would have already replaced you. Like, it's, so I think it's like, figure it out, do the long work. It's the same thing. It's like, it's all this stuff. Like, we got to figure out, we got to lean in. So I would say, get an eternal perspective and then do the hard work. And you listen to podcasts like this, get perspective. We all need like an injection of encouragement. Trust me, I've had many of those. Jeff, you and I have done this. We've talked about different frustrations so many times, and we use that to kind of, and this is why you created this podcast, to help people along the journey. So I would just say, come from eternal perspective. Kind of, I would like probably, slap you on the face a little bit and say, like, keep going, and then you might point at people in the Bible and go, I mean, are we really, is it harder than that? No. And so, like, we can do this, and then just live it out, execute your vision in controlled things that you can influence. And trust me, if they see momentum, it can kind of, it will expand. It might not expand in your timeline, but God's timeline tends to be a little longer usually.
Yeah, what was it? It was Peter that was crucified upside down, right? Getting my So Peter's crucified upside down. I think you can handle like somebody not agreeing with you in the workplace. Yeah. So that was well said right there. Thank you for that. We're 275 episodes into encouraging people on their innovative journey. So been lots of conversations and encouragement along the way with that. And maybe I need to go back and count. Maybe half a dozen or more with you, man. You've been regular on this as well, and so I want to thank you for your encouragement, even at my level, for encouraging me on that. We've been working on projects and things even outside of the podcast relationship here and what you're doing at Saddleback, and I'm always encouraged when I'm hanging out with my friend Jay Kranda, and especially when the heat are up. And it's at least more encouraged in that season. You can listen to the first 3 minutes if you skipped over that to understand why. But hey, we're going to land a plane. Jay, it's always great hanging out with you, man. And I'll have to come out to SoCal and for some reason make an excuse to fly out and come hang out with you again. But we're going to wrap it. And so for Jay, this is Jeff with the Church.digital and Digital Church Network. Thanks for jumping on the podcast here. See you next time on the show. You all have a good day.